Determining the validity or invalidity of categorical system. Introduction. In this study session, we will examine both the validity and invalidity of categorical syllogism and the rules needed to be able to test for a true categorical syllogism. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Determine the validity or invalidity of categorical syllogism. 2. Use rules test for categorical syllogism. Validity or invalidity. The validity or invalidity of categorical syllogism can be determined in several ways. First, the form of a syllogism may help us to determine whether or not the argument is valid. Bello, 2000. If an argument is valid, then any argument having that form will be valid, and if an argument form is invalid, then any argument having that form will also be invalid. Again, there is the method of using diagram to determine the validity or invalidity of categorical syllogism. Two of such methods were developed by John Verne and the Swiss mathematician Leonhard Euler. Copy 1978, Bello 2000. Finally, there is the rules test for determining the validity or invalidity of categorical syllogism. Our main concern in this lecture is with this latest method, that is, the rules test for determining the validity or invalidity of categorical syllogism. Rules test for categorical syllogism. There are 6 rules which a standard form categorical syllogism must not violate for it to be valid. Any argument that violates one of such rules is invalid and is said to commit a formal fallacy. Let us now examine the rules and fallacies one after the other. Rule 1. A standard form categorical syllogism must contain exactly 3 terms, each of which must be used in the same sense throughout the argument. If a syllogism has more than 3 terms, it breaks Rule 1 and commits the fallacy of 4 terms, or what in Latin is called uartenium terminorum. If a term is used in different senses in the same argument, the argument also breaks Rule 1 and commits the fallacy of equivocation. Consider the following argument. No wealthy men are social critics because no wealthy men are antagonists, and all labor leaders are antagonists. The above argument breaks Rule 1 because it contains more than 3 terms. Precisely, it contains exactly 4 terms, to wit, wealthy men, social critics, antagonists, and labor leaders. The argument is therefore invalid. Rule 2. In a valid standard form categorical syllogism, the middle term must be distributed in at least one of the premises. Any syllogism whose middle term is not distributed in at least one premise breaks Rule 2 and is said to commit the fallacy of undistributed middle term. The following argument is invalid because the middle term, militant, is not distributed in any of the premises. All indigents of Rivers State are militants. All Bayelsans are militants. Therefore, all indigents of Rivers State are Bayelsans. Rule 3. In a standard form categorical syllogism, if any term is distributed in the conclusion of the argument, such a term must be distributed in the relevant premise. There are two ways in which Rule 3 may be broken. A. In a syllogism, if the major term is distributed in the conclusion, but the same term is not distributed in the major premise, the syllogism is invalid because it breaks Rule 3 and commits the fallacy of illicit major. The following argument breaks Rule 3 and commits the fallacy just mentioned. Some men are good politicians. No criminals are men. No criminals are good politicians. B. If the minor term of a syllogism is distributed in the conclusion of the argument, but the same term is not distributed in the minor premise, then the syllogism violates Rule 3 and commits the fallacy of illicit minor. The following argument breaks Rule 3 and commits the fallacy of illicit minor. All good politicians are men. Some criminals are not men. No criminals are good politicians. Rule 4. No standard form categorical syllogism with two negative premises can be valid. Any categorical syllogism with two negative premises is invalid and breaks Rule 4. Such a syllogism is said to commit the fallacy of exclusive premises. The following argument breaks Rule 4 and commits the fallacy of exclusive premises. Some men are not good politicians. No criminals are men. No criminals are good politicians. Rule 5. If any of the premises of a categorical syllogism is negative, the conclusion must be negative for the syllogism to be valid. Any argument that breaks this rule commits the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. The following argument breaks Rule 5 and commits the fallacy just mentioned. Some men are not good politicians. Some criminals are men. All criminals are good politicians. Rule 6. No valid standard form categorical syllogism with a particular conclusion can have two universal premises. In other words, if the conclusion of a valid categorical syllogism is particular, one of the premises must be particular. Any syllogism which violates Rule 6 is said to commit the existential fallacy. The following argument breaks Rule 6 and commits the existential fallacy. All men are good politicians. No criminals are men. Some criminals are not good politicians. To test the validity or invalidity of categorical syllogisms by using the rules, what we do is to write the argument in standard form by writing the major premise first, followed by the minor premise, and then the conclusion. After this, we apply the rules to the argument one after the other. If the argument passes all the rules, then it is valid. But if an argument fails any, at least one, of the rules, then the argument is invalid. What does it mean for a categorical syllogism to be valid? A categorical syllogism is said to be valid if it is not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false. Study session summary. In this study session, we treated the 6 rules which a standard form categorical syllogism must not violate for it to be valid. Any syllogism that violates one of such rules is invalid and is said to commit a corresponding fallacy. To test whether or not a categorical syllogism is valid, what we do is to first write the argument in standard form by writing the major premise first, followed by the minor premise, and then the conclusion. After this, we apply the rules to the argument one after the other. If the argument passes all the rules, then it is valid. But if an argument fails any, at least one, of the rules, then the argument is invalid. That ends study session 6.